My name is Phil Zito. I am the presenter for today's topic, which is going to be structuring your BAS team for success. So what does success look like for a lot of folks? It looks like profit. Some folks, it looks like growth. Other folks, it looks like retention. So we're going to talk through kind of those three angles: profit, growing the profitability of your team, growing your team, just simply growing it. And we're going to talk through retaining the talent as you bring them on. We're going to talk through some common organizational structures, and we're going to go through some KPIs around how your team performs. So my name is Phil Zito. In a prior life, I ran a $60 million P&L, profit and loss center, had about 22 technicians, did anywhere from 60 to 120 projects at any given time. And since then, I've moved through various roles. And now I run Smart Buildings Academy, where we help companies and individuals develop their skills to succeed in the career field of building automation. So in today's webinar, we're going to be using our whiteboard. So I'm going to switch that over. I'm going to walk over to that. I will not be able to see what is being typed, so Nicole will hop on and let me know if you all have any questions. Feel free to interrupt at any time. I'm very ad hoc in my teaching style. Some of you all know that because some of you are my students. Others, this is your first time attending a webinar, welcome. And we're going to have a lot of fun. So the first thing I want to go through here are the common building automation roles. And specifically, we're going to be focused on construction and service. So I'm just going to draw a line here in the middle of my screen. I'm just going to double check that I hit record. Just double check. Yep.
You are recording.
All right. There's a running joke within our organization that I have a tendency to not record our webinars. And then I have to re-record them. And they're nowhere near as good because there's no one in the webinar when I'm re-recording it. All right. So what I want to do here is I'm going to talk about construction, and we're going to talk about service roles. Okay. Now, the service roles are pretty easy, and it's kind of where I cut my teeth actually in this industry. And then I moved over really into construction. But service, you're going to have kind of three types of tasks that you're going to be doing. You're going to be doing maintenance tasks. You're going to be doing service tasks, and you're going to be doing retrofit tasks. Now, organizationally, with these three tasks here, organizationally, you're typically going to have a service dispatch. And if I'm even too low level for some of you, let us know in the comments, because I'm assuming you understand what service work is. I'm assuming you understand what install work is. I'm assuming you have a basic understanding of building automation for you attending this webinar on how to structure your teams. But you're going to have a service dispatch, and typically you will have a lead service tech, and then you'll have service techs underneath them. This is how I've seen almost everyone structure their service teams. Sometimes they will have a blended controls mechanical role, depending on, is it a union state? Is it required? Do you have to have licensure, et cetera? Sometimes it'll be a blended electrician and technician role. Sometimes it'll be technicians and mechanics and electricians. I will say of the three, the least common role I see in service is an electrician. I will very often in controls, I'll see lead service tech and a service tech that will fall under service dispatch or be parallel to service dispatch. And this is in controls companies. Now, in a mechanical company, you will typically have a mechanical superintendent, which is like a lead service tech. You will have the mechanics underneath that person. And then they will typically expand over and build a controls team. We'll talk more about this in a second. But these are kind of your roles and your tasks. And we'll come back to this. And the reason I left space here is we're going to put some KPIs around this information. And KPIs are key performance indicators. They basically indicate the performance, and they're the metrics at which you measure the success of your organization against. All right, so for construction, I see this breakout into three kind of buckets. I'm going to put 1 mil, 10 mil, and 100 mil. So at 1 mil, we are typically going and we are using a small startup company, probably a handful of people, because your average technician, depending on what they can handle, an average technician is going to be handling anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 of work. Sometimes you can get more, sometimes you can get less. It really just depends on the tasks associated with the work, and we're going to hammer tasks really intensely in just a second. But we've got 1 mil, 10 mil, and 100 mil. So 1 mil is going to be typically the super tech. This is someone who was, at a company, decided to leave the company and create some controls business for themselves. They are aiming for this $1 million of revenue. It's typically going to be a service tech and maybe one, or a super tech and one other tech. And that super tech is going to be doing sales and PM. And then the tech under them is typically going to be doing programming, design, and install. $1 million worth of jobs is going to be anywhere from 2 to 10 projects. Sometimes, depending on the metro, you can get upwards of 25 projects. It is going to be extremely hard for a $1 million business to execute 25 projects just due to the project management and the fact that you need to be in multiple places at once. So when you're in this $1 million window, your typical strategy for growth is, and I'll cover this in much more detail later, but your typical strategy for growth is to split these roles, sales and PM, and then start to build up the technical talent so that you can move into this $10 million. When you move into the $10 million construction team, you tend to have a sales team, and I'm not going to talk a lot about sales. I'm going to talk a lot about the technical side of things. And under the sales team, you're typically going to have a PM, and you may have 2 PMs. You may have 5 mil for one, 5 mil for another. I've seen it split down to as low as 1 million per PM. I think that depending on the project size and scope, that may be required. I've also seen PMs take on 10 million just by themselves. It really comes down to the scope of work that you're handling. So you've got this PM, and then under the PM, you're going to have a team, typically matrixed. So you'll have a programmer, a designer, and a technician. And it's at this point that you start to see the conveyor belt approach. I know a lot of people like the super tech. I've never seen anyone grow past $10 million of revenue using the super tech model. There's a reason why, if you look at almost any of the OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, the Trains, the Johnsons, the Siemens, excuse me, when you get to their major projects and you get to their regional teams, which we'll talk about here in just a second, they follow this conveyor belt model. You have a designer who's going to do the submittals, they're going to do the graphics, and then you have the technician who is going to oversee the subcontractors and oversee the execution of the subcontracted work. And then you have the programmer who's going to write the programs, which get given to the technician who downloads them and who does point-to-point and functional test. Now, when you move from here over to 100 mil, you're starting to look at a 3 to 5 branch office structure. So you're starting to see a 3 to 5 branch office. You're starting to tend to have a lead operations manager that is over this area. You'll have an ops manager. And the ops manager is over this kind of general area. You'll tend to have a branch or office manager. And then under them, you'll tend to have PMs, and either the technical talent is reporting to the PM or the technical talent is reporting to this office manager, branch manager, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes you'll have sales reporting to this person as well right here. So as you start to build out the structure, you'll start to see that the biggest barrier to growth is right here. If you can figure out how to transition from 1 mil to 10 mil, then from going to 10 mil to 100 mil, it's all about processes, measuring your tasks and your KPIs, and just driving process adherence and driving to the KPIs that result in growth. Any questions so far on anything we covered? I'm just going to walk over, see if there's anything in the chat. Okay. All right. So at this point, we have a basic understanding. Is anyone at all confused by these structures or roles? Because if you're at all confused by these structures or roles, as I start to go into task breakout matrices, backlog management, labor management, things like that, it's not going to make sense.
So we have a question in chat.
Yeah, let's take a look. At the super tech level, is it typically one person doing it all? It's typically 1 to 2. Usually you'll have someone who has more of a business sales bent, and that person is going to be doing the selling and typically the business and financial management. And then you'll have a technical person, and that person is going to be doing the PMing, the programming, the graphics, the teching. It's typically what I see. And then they will gradually add techs. The way I see them grow, and it's not the way I recommend them to grow, but they will typically add techs and add techs and add techs and burn through their backlog and then collapse back to letting those people go and just being those 2 people. When you add a tech, you should also be considering, how do you add a salesperson? Because it is going to be that salesperson that is going to go and bring in more work. So you can't neglect sales. While growing from 1 million to 10 million, what should the super tech transfer to do? So in my experience, it depends on that person's skills. I find that super techs translate really well to building out service departments because of their skill set. So what I tend to do is, one of the best ways to support a growing organization, because when you're between 10 to 100 mil, you have a lot more leeway for cash flow issues, basically. So what you can do is you can build out service groups, which are going to hedge your construction work, because construction work is going to be cyclical. It's going to have peaks and valleys, and it's going to be dependent largely on paid when paid, typically. And POC execution, so percent of completion execution as far as your billings and cash flows. So you offset that with warranty, service work, PM work, and retrofit work. That will carry you through the shoulder months when no one's building. That will also go and give you stickiness with your customers so that you can continue to succeed with your customers. All right. Does that make sense on the super tech and where they would transfer to Nicholas? What are the 3 functions I have listed under the ops manager? Those aren't necessarily functions as much as those are technical roles. And those are project management, design, or programming, sorry. No, I was right. Project management, technician. I didn't finish that out, did I? No. It would be project management, technicians, programmers, and designers. So it'd be 4 roles that typically fall under the ops manager. Okay, good stuff. Let me take a sip of water. I really need to remember to get a humidifier for this room. It gets so dry in here, and then I start coughing, and I feel like I'm destroying y'all's ears. Okay, so let's move to what, in my opinion, is the most powerful
Switch the
thing.
camera.
Oh, yeah. You guys see what happens when I'm left to my own devices? It just does not go well. There we go. Yes, we are a professional training organization. I'm not. The rest of them are. All right. So the thing I find that is really beneficial as you grow And it's really difficult to implement this into an existing legacy organization, but it's easy to implement this as you grow. And it's task-based management. Task-based management. And this is where our KPIs are all going to come into play. So what I like to do, and I teach this in our scoping and estimating course, I teach this in our project management bootcamp course as well. And what I do is instead of using a single labor rate, which is what you're going to do when you're a $1 million business, right? You're going to have a labor rate for that super tech, and that's what gets billed out against everything. Now, as you start to build out your talent, you're going to have, your install tech. You're going to have your programmer, right? You're going to have your designer. Excuse me. And let's say that your tech is 30 an hour. Say your programmer is 60 an hour. And let's say your designer is 45 an hour. Now, as your salespeople sell, they are going to write their estimates based on a specific labor rate and not a blended labor rate. Then, as you do backlog management, as you do forecasting, and you do your 12 or your quarter forecast, your 12-month or your quarter forecast, and you forecast out your labor, you're going to, let's say we have $1,000. We're going to allocate that accordingly to the right buckets. And these buckets are going to be determined both by the estimates that are created by the sales team, as well as your experience as a PM as to what needs to be done on tasks. Then you're going to log all this and keep this information historically. And when you have this information, you're going to say, okay, for hospitals, this is like we use 100 hours, maybe we used 30 hours, and maybe we used 40 hours. And you're going to know, so for in hospital, this is what we used. And then you're going to be able to come back on the next hospital project and say, oh, okay, these are the hours we used. You're going to be able to feed this information back to your sales team. And your sales team is going to be able to have more accurate estimates. You're also going to evaluate if you know the estimate was right, but your team was inefficient. You're going to be able to evaluate, okay, why was my team inefficient? Let's say the estimate was 70 hours, but we did 100 hours as a technician. And what we learned is that we didn't line out our subcontractors right. Well, then what's going to happen is we are going to move into what's called a process pattern. And what does that look like? The process pattern is where we're going to say, okay, we're 30 hours over. Why are we 30 hours over? We're going to do some root cause analysis. And like I said, we determined our subcontractors weren't properly lined out. They weren't properly trained on how to install things, and we had to go and fix stuff. Okay, so we start to develop a subcontractor lineout process. And what I want you to see here, what I want you to focus on is not that we're creating a subcontractor lineout process, but that we are identifying a gap between estimated and actual executed labor. We're using root cause analysis to figure out why that occurred. And then we are putting a process in place that we are going to train our team to. And that process then, right, is going to go, we're going to train our team and we're going to document our process. And then that's what our team does going forward. For example, the subcontractor lineout process would be something like, okay, going forward, we're going to have electrical details. Our subcontractors are going to be trained on how to terminate to these electrical details. So this would involve the designer who has to create the electrical details. This would involve the technician who has to train the electrical sub on the electrical details. And this becomes a process. And then to take it a step further, excuse me, we can do a qualification process where when we get big enough, we start to say, okay, we're going to qualify our subcontractors and we're going to bring them in once every 6 months and train them for half a day on how to do our installations so that they're pre-trained. And then they get qualified and then they can actually bid and qualify for our projects. Now, granted, I'll be honest with you, the kind of climate we're in right now where it's really hard to find anyone to do work, that's probably not going to be something you want to do right now. But when work slows down, that is definitely something where you can become more selective of your subcontractors. So that's the process pattern method. I'm going to take a sip of water and I'm going to move my water over here. So it is so dry in here. Any questions on this so far? This is by far the biggest difference between high profit building automation businesses and low profit building automation businesses. You could sell all day long, but getting to processes where you can go and repeatedly make sure that you are mitigating the risks to your business. And what are these risks? They're typically in subcontractors, design, programming, point-to-point checkout, functional test. These are all risk areas. And when you start to figure out where the risks lie for your business, because this is going to be specific to your team. So you may have a designer that's really good on panel layouts, really good on electrical details, doesn't know how HVAC works to save their life. And so when they get a sequence of operations that doesn't work, they can't look at it and say, this isn't going to work, because they don't have that skill. And so in that case, you're going to have to go and train them on that. And maybe put a process in place where they work with someone within your organization who has that expertise. So maybe you have a sequence review that is triggered when the designer feels like the sequence is getting too complex. That could be a process that you put in place. So you want to tailor these based on your team's experience level. Excuse me. Okay. Any questions on that? Let me clear all this off. And we're still using white. Good. Oh, we got one. All right, hold on. Let me take a look. So company layout has wiring done by other electricians. Do I see many BAS companies hiring their own wiring installers? Not typically if they want to scale to, $100, $200 million. And the reason why is you get to a point where your portfolio of work is so large that to man an install team is a very high cost, and there is a risk associated with that cost. And that risk can be mitigated through using subcontractors. There's two main reasons to use subcontractors. The first being risk mitigation. By going and having them scope and estimate the work, you are shifting the risk onto them to execute what they estimated. And if they misestimate, then that's on them. The second is staffing. So oftentimes you will have 3 to 4 subcontractors working for you at any given time in a large BAS business, because those subcontractors can only man up so much. And for you to have a superintendent and your journeyman electricians, assuming you're union, to have you have that and have that on staff is an expense. It's a very high expense for something that is a relatively small portion of your building automation project costs. So subcontractors can be anywhere from 20 to 40% of the cost of a project, but I see that shifting substantially lately with us using IP controls, people starting to move towards more of a retrofit and service-based model using software, things like that. What is the best way to build risk into an estimate? I'm not going to go too deep into this because it's more of a sales question, but historical risk, in my experience, is the best way to build risk into an estimate. Basically, you look at your team's historical performance against a specific vertical market, a vertical market being like healthcare, higher ed, K through 12, et cetera. And you look at their historical performance, and based on the gap between estimated and executed, you will then go and determine a risk percentage. Give me 1 second. My headset just decided to turn itself off. There we go. And yeah. All right. So let's move back to the whiteboard. This time I will remember to turn it on. All right, so let's talk through some KPIs. I was talking with my team earlier today. I was just bouncing off ideas off them around KPIs. We came up with a couple. So I'm going to break these into construction and service KPIs. And I'm a firm believer that if you want to grow from this 10 million to 100 million revenue market, one of the best ways to do that is through service work. Because if we look at a traditional market, just clear this off, you're going to have ebbs and flows. So, summer, you're going to have a lot of work. Then, maybe fall, you'll have an uptick. And so, winter, you won't really have a lot of work. And then you'll have summer. And then maybe you'll have a little fall bump. But what you do with service work is the service work is going to kind of bridge these gaps right here. And what that does is this is going to lift up your bottom because you still have a payroll that you need to meet. Even though your payroll is being met here, what happens is, and this is why I see a lot of mid-sized companies struggle to grow, is their payroll is met for the year by this summer and fall work window. And what then happens when you do that is you basically eat up all the profit, which you're going to utilize that profit to grow. And by eating up that profit, you then struggle to hire new sales teams. You struggle to build out a service team. You struggle to make growth decisions. By having a service team to bridge that, by having, and what I think should be done on almost every project, if possible, is to offer a post-warranty support option. They could turn it down, but at least offer it. And then when you do that, as you start to gradually build up your service portfolio, that is going to bring up this bottom, which is where you're paying payroll, but you're not generating any profit. And as you bring up this bottom, you're then going to introduce more profit into the business. Any questions on that before I move into KPIs? All right, so key performance indicators. It surprises me, and my team and I talk about this, when we work with a lot of companies that they have no tracking of their performance. When we ask them their KPIs, they don't have them, and these are sizable companies. So that's an opportunity for a company to really improve, because what you measure, you're going to be able to impact, because otherwise you're making decisions in the blind or in the dark. So for construction, I like margin per FTE and utilization. Now, when I worked at a large OEM, I was told you want to aim for 90% utilization or greater. One, I think that's unrealistic. And two, I think that will burn out your people. Utilization is how much of their time is being charged to a project. And you can have 90% utilization and not be profitable. And that's why there is also margin per FTE. These two kind of coexist. And the reason why is I can have a project that has $100 in it, and $10 of that $100 is margin, and I'm charging $100, right? Now, that's fine if that's how it was estimated. The problem becomes I charge $200. I am technically utilized, but I am now in negative margin per full-time equivalent or full-time employee, depending on how you like the FTE definition or acronym. So do not chase utilization at the risk of eroding margin. Because what will happen is you estimate a project, $100, $200 of it is margin. You execute it at $100 and $200 of that is margin. You get $200 or $20 rather, $20 of profit that you can put back into your business. If you execute that at $150, then you have -30 margin. And now you're taking $30 out of your business to pay for that. Okay. And this actually should have been 120 to make that math work, but I don't do math on the fly. All right. Utilization, though, I recommend anywhere between 70 to 85%. That gives you downtime for training. That gives you, and ideally more towards this 85%. If you're doing super high margin work, you can get away with a 70%. If you're doing MSI integration work, that's very high margin. But if you're doing low margin plan and spec work, you want to aim more towards a higher utilization. The rule is the lower the margin the work, typically the higher the utilization has to be to squeeze all that margin out. All right, and once we've got that number, right, we're around 70 to 85%. Then we focus on our margin per FTE. This is all across the board. I mean, back when I was managing, we would look for anything from like 7 to 10K a month. But that was years ago. So this number is all across the board. It depends where you're working, what kind of work you're doing. That's going to be up to you to figure out. Obviously, that margin per FTE is going to be much higher if you're doing service work versus if you're doing construction work due to the profit margins associated with that. Next up is service. On service, talked about backlog. My sales manager and I were going back and forth on this. He was recommending having about 1,000 hours of backlog per full-time employee per service tech. And that is PM work, so preventative maintenance work. And then the rest of the time is going to be time and materials and retrofit. And the reasoning behind this is that as you do these PMs, as you do these preventative maintenance, you're going to find time and material work. You're going to find retrofit work. And if you have someone that's 2,000 hours, because remember, we could do 2,080 hours at 52 weeks at 40 hours a week. Take away 2 weeks for vacation, you got about 2,000 hours. That's usually what you can get on a 100% utilized person. You cut that by 70%, that gives you 1,400 hours. I think if I'm doing the math right. And if you go to that 80%, it'd be 1,600 hours. So if you had someone doing more than 1,000 hours of PM, they would never be able to do time and material, never do retrofit. And that's where a lot of your large margin comes in. And that's also where you start to expand your installed base. You start to expand your installed base by going and doing retrofit work and then gradually taking over one of your competitors' building automation systems. I see we got a question, so I'm going to check that out real quick. An FTE is a full-time equivalent or full-time employee, basically. Okay, cool. So we talked about our KPIs, right? We talked about our organizational structures. And now I'm going to talk about how do we grow. So let me go to page 5 here. Let me clear this off. And I'm just going to pause for just a second, see if anybody has any questions on anything we covered before we kind of switch gears and talk about growth. I won't be taking live voice questions today, but I will take questions if you type them into the chat. Just due to this being recorded, and I want to protect the sound quality. I'll give you all a second just to type in any questions you got. Okay. All right, well then let's move back over to the whiteboard and let's talk growth strategy. So if I were to list importance of growth strategies, the first would be processes. So I'm going to go through a bunch of processes that I'm going to list out. This isn't an inclusive list or an exhaustive list, but it should give you some starting ground. Release to operations. This is going to be where you go and your sales team comes along and they review the project and they hand it off to the ops team, and the ops team does any clarifications, any reestimates, anything that needs to be done prior to the project booking. We're going to have our submittal process. Our submittal process is going to be largely driven by the specification, but the submittal is the most important part outside of the release to operations, because the submittal usually is the phase gate. So it's the blocking gate at which point, once you've completed the submittal and got it approved, then you're able to bill, you're able to order material, and you're able to start execution. On most projects, you will not be able to do billings, you will not be able to do execution or material orders until you have approved submittals. From there, we move to our subcontractor line-out process. And if you're following our podcast, we're covering these on our podcast episodes for the past several weeks. These are the processes we've been going through. Once we've lined out our subs, then we move to our point-to-point process and potentially our functional test process. We have a programming process. We have a graphics process. We have a training process. And we have a closeout process. And so point-to-point, functional test, point-to-point is making sure your inputs and outputs work. Functional test is making sure the system adheres to the sequence of operations. That is not to be confused with commissioning. That's a whole separate thing. Programming, excuse me, there is a process to programming, how you digest a sequence of operations, how you pull out your inputs and outputs, your binary logic, your analog logic, how you build out a design pattern, a library of design patterns, and a library of programs that you can then use, because initially you're going to be writing your programs from scratch unless the software tool you're using has something to assist you in auto building programs, which some do, some don't. But as you build out your programming library, you're going to want to then use that. Graphics, you're going to want to have a graphics intake process. You know, what colors do you want? What layouts do you want? What level of graphics do you want? Are we subcontracting out these graphics or are we not? And you'll want to build that out. And then training, you'll want to have customer training. Most of the time, the better trained your customer, the more likely they are going to use you in service. I know that seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you have a customer who's not trained on their building automation system, there's a high likelihood that they're never going to touch the building automation system, so they won't realize there's things they want to do with it. So they're not going to reach out to you for retrofit or time and material on the service side. But if you train them and they actually know how to use it and they become dependent on it, then they're going to reach out to you because they're going to find things they don't like. They're going to find things they want changed. They're going to find things they want training on, and you're going to be able to go and support them on that. So I want to repeat that because that's critical to growing your service business, which is a well-trained customer is a customer who will use their building automation system. And if they use their building automation system, there's a high likelihood they're going to turn to you for services. And then finally, close out. This is warranty. This is going and getting our retainage, which is the last percentage of our project. These are the processes that make a successful organization. And if you do not already have these kind of processes documented and built out, I encourage you to build them out. Just start at the beginning and slowly work through them, document them, train your team on them, and hold your team accountable to them. So that's the first step to growing your business. And we'll talk about expanding into verticals and growing your service team and stuff like that in just a second. Any questions on that before I go through KPIs and task-based management? Excuse me. No questions? Okay, I'm still coming through good, right? Yep. Okay, good. RTO handoff prior to booking. Why? Because you want to go and, well, I mean, technically you could book it and then do release to operations and re-estimate it. It really just depends on your company's booking system. Some companies, you're going to book it and then you're going to re-estimate it in the project. And sometimes you're going to re-estimate it prior to booking. The sell price is not going to change. What's changing is the costs. So the sell price is going to stay the same, but the costs are going to change. Would I recommend re-estimating every single project? No. There's a point of diminishing returns. The whole purpose of re-estimates is to, one, get your sales and execution closer. You should not go and re-estimate projects because you have a poorly trained team. If your team simply cannot execute because they are inept and they don't know what they're doing, that is not a reason to re-estimate projects. The purpose of re-estimating is you review the project and you realize that the salesperson missed something or they did something wrong, and then you re-estimate it to accurately represent that. So they missed an air handler. They missed the fact that there's a backnet interface. And you train the sales team like, hey, you missed this. Hey, you missed that. Typically, you know, you're wanting to do re-estimates on mid like 50,000 and up in project costs. But it shouldn't be done on every project. It should just be done. You should do an RTO on every project, in my opinion. But re-estimates are going to be driven by what was missed in the scope. They should not be, and I'm going to repeat this, re-estimates should not be made because your team cannot execute. They should be made because scope was missed or a timeline got compressed or something like that. And also, if timeline gets compressed or an addendum comes out and you have to add scope, you should be doing a change order if appropriate. All right. So move to KPIs. Okay, so KPIs, as I mentioned, are going to be margin per FTE, utilization, booked versus executed margin, trade working capital, which is, you know, your billings versus your, it's basically how much cash flow do you have. So those are going to be your key KPIs. And then you'll want to establish those and measure those. And you're going to want to have task-based roles. So task-based tracking. And this can be as simple as having install, program, design, PM. And you implement this task-based tracking in your systems, and you just ensure that you're tracking where your labor costs are going to. And obviously you have subcontractor and material costs as well. So let's go here. For service, using the same methodology. For processes, we're going to have our dispatch process. We're going to have our PM list. This is going to be a list of our common PMs that we perform. We're going to have our retrofit process. And our retrofit process is going to basically follow that new project execution process, but we're going to add a site visit and site analysis aspect to it. So you have dispatch, you have a PM, you have a retrofit, and then you have a time and materials process for estimating and executing time and materials. Our KPIs here, once again, are typically going to be margin per FTE, PM, hours, per FTE. So these are going to be your, and then you can also add a KPI, which is going to be around booked work per FTE. So this is basically, they go out and they find time and material or retrofit opportunities. Task-based billing, you're going to have your PM tasks, preventative maintenance, not project management. And that's going to be, you know, typically broken out into a senior and a regular category. And then you'll have your retrofit tasks, which are typically going to break out across the common categories: tech, designer, PM, and programmer. And this depends on if you do inter-division labor sharing. Like, for example, you go and do cost transfers to a technician or a designer. I'll get to those questions in just a second. All right, so let's take a look at those. Excuse me. Are designers and estimators the same person in organizations? Typically not. Estimators are typically a burdened, why is the term slipping my head? They're typically an SG&A cost, so an overhead cost, and designers are typically a billable cost. So estimators are pre-sales and designers are post-sales. Now, in smaller organizations, they can be the same person and you can do like a 50% utilization. But if you're going to grow, you typically are going to have one estimator for every couple salespeople. What is recommended percent of margin per FTE? Oh, I'm having to go way back in my mental library here. If we have $1 million and we man 2 to 4 techs on that, and $1 million is 20%, 200,000. So 4 divided into 200,000, 50,000. So you'd look at like 20 to 25%, right about there, of the total executed margin per FTE. But I mean, that's such a swag number. That's not what I would look at personally, Rob, because I mean, let's say you're doing a integration where it's like pure margin and it's not a lot of work. But because of the skill level associated with integration, you can charge a much higher margin. Then it would be really skewed versus like plan and spec work where, I mean, it's like, how low can you go to do this, you know, basic office building? Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions before we move on to market expansion? Okay. It should be no mystery if you've listened to the podcast for the past couple months. I am a huge advocate of retrofit work. I really believe that the commercial sector is just going to collapse. I don't think it's going to completely collapse because a lot of the pension funds and a lot of the retirement funds of city officials and city workers are tied to real estate trusts, as well as the labor unions are largely tied to real estate trusts. So I don't think they're going to let the real estate market on the commercial side collapse, but I do see a consolidation. I know one of my peers at my company is much more favorable and believes in the market more than I do. I'm more pessimistic. I feel like, you know, you look at companies like Microsoft and Amazon and these large, massive companies that are like, hey, we don't really need offices anymore. So I feel like that's going to happen, which is going to lead to a real big shrink in commercial assets. I don't know what they're going to do with them, whether they repurpose them to multifamily or mixed use or what. I don't know. If I could figure that out, I'd make some investments. But I do believe we are going to largely shift to a retrofit market where we're going to be taking existing assets and modernizing those versus going and building new assets. Now, I know for every time I say that, people email me and they point out a micro example of a new campus or building that's being built in their metro. But if you look at it from a macro perspective, it seems like we're executing already booked backlog, but new designs are going down. I could be wrong. I don't have the empirical data at my fingertips to support that. That's just based on my gut, listening to people talk and what I envision just based on the dynamics. That being said, I've met too many companies that have good construction teams, but poor to non-existent service teams, or have good service teams, but poor to non-existent construction teams. Personally, I would rather have a service team than a construction team. Service, because of the skill set required in the technicians to execute service well, leaves you open to doing retrofit work as well as PM work, whereas construction, right, wrong, or indifferent, it is a lower skill set for the average construction project. Now, I'm not saying those of you who do like Microsoft data centers or Amazon data centers or things like that, that is definitely high skilled work. Hospitals, high skilled work, but your average commercial office building is not that hard to execute. So that being said, if I were to look at two structures, I would prefer service, knowing that I'm going to have a higher salary cost, but I'm also going to make higher margin. That being said, I see a lot of construction work that has no service work. So what I encourage you to do for growth is to identify your vertical market. Step one. What vertical markets do you specialize in? What do you serve? Building up vertical market specialization, like maybe we do healthcare. We're known for doing healthcare. We're known for doing K through 12. Excuse me. And having 2 to 3 vertical market specializations is really going to, one, it's going to make your life a lot easier. It's going to increase your profit on your projects. And here's why. You're going to have from a marketing perspective, a list of buildings in that vertical market that you can show off from an expertise perspective. 2, you're going to learn how these projects execute. They tend to use very similar designs. K through 12 tends to have, an air-cooled chiller and some unit ventilators. Hospitals tend to have central utility plants, 100% outdoor air units, dedicated outdoor air systems, etc. So once you learn these system types, you can go and program them, do graphics, do system checkout, do functional test quite easily because you've become an expert on those system types. So by focusing on a vertical market, you're going to build proof within the market, but you're also going to build expertise. Additionally, by focusing on a vertical market, you can now start to build what's called a life cycle approach to your buildings. So if we think of a building life cycle, right, we've got design, construct, operate, and then we have, replace, improve. Most of you out here are focused on construct. And you're not doing operate, you're not doing design, you're not doing replace, improve. By going and focusing on a vertical market, you can say, okay, we've got the construct for healthcare. Now we're going to look at how do we support operators in healthcare? What can we do from a PM perspective? What can we do from an analytics perspective? What can we do to help them operate their building? Then we're going to take all this expert. So the natural progression is this: 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll start with construct. You'll take that expertise into operate to help them support operating of that building type. Then you'll take all the expertise you learn in construct and operate, and you'll use that to guide them in replace and improve. So this is where you'll say, okay, you need more beds, or your imaging is inefficient, or your ORs are inefficient. We're going to help you improve that. And then you're going to take that expertise on this side, and maybe you partner with an engineering firm, maybe you bring engineers in-house, and then you move to design, and you become a life cycle controls company. And when you do that, you then break yourself from the cycles of the market, because when construction's down, operation is typically up. And if you do this across 3 opposing vertical markets, like maybe you do healthcare, you do K through 12, and you do higher ed, or maybe no, higher ed's a bad example. Corporate campus, K through 12, and healthcare. When corporate campuses go down, healthcare or K through 12 may be up. And so you're balancing out. So you have a portfolio in all 4 phases that is going to carry you through. That's one of the biggest ways to grow. This is a lot to unpack. I'm going to see if anyone has any questions on it. Let me move this over here. And I'm going to switch us to question and answer in just a second. All right. No questions. All right, cool. Super easy. Okay, so we talked about construction, talked about vertical market, and our other avenue to growth outside of vertical market is going to be lateral technologies. So lateral technologies are technologies that are within the building, within typically the construction process. This would be things like lighting, excuse me, access control, fire security, life safety. By going and picking up lateral technologies, and you see this a lot when you see mechanical contractors who also do controls, they'll get the mechanical work and then they'll get the controls work. Well, if you get the controls work and you also get the lighting work, or you also get the access control work, that then exposes you to having more share of wallet on either that project or on the operation of the building, et cetera. This life cycle still remains, but the life cycle may be different. You may be in construct and operate on building automation, but they may be in replace, improve for their access control. So they may have a legacy access control. And because you do both, and because you're involved in operating and talking with their facilities team, you may get exposed and realize that they're unsatisfied with their access control. And then you can also go and sell that at the same time. And you can then move yourself into construct on the access control. So this is a way for you to grow as well. Personally, I would master my vertical market, my proof, and my expertise first. Now, just because of where we're at time frame, I'm going to move us just over here, and because this took a little bit longer than I thought it would actually. And I'm going to move to question and answer. I'm going to see what questions any of y'all have. Did this deliver what you all were expecting it to deliver? Did you learn something from this? Please type yes. That is the right answer. Hopefully. Awesome. Good stuff. You're welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And now, so what I do on every podcast, what I do on every webinar is I stay and I answer whatever questions you all have. So, we are a firm believer in that, 80–90% of what we produce is free content. The other 10% is what pays the bills. And that's our training programs, courses, and workforce development services. But right now, we're not focused on selling you on something. We're just here to answer your questions and educate you. So feel free to ask away. What about outsourcing services? So when you say outsourcing, I assume, are you meaning taking your staff and providing them to other folks who maybe don't have enough staff? Or are you talking about using someone else's staff to augment your folks? I personally, I go back and forth with this on my team. I feel like there is a market for all these folks right now who are retiring, who are leaving the industry, to put together like a Angie's List or an Upwork for building automation. I feel like it would be difficult to do, but I feel like it would be very profitable. The challenge with that is managing scope, managing risk, and managing cash flow. It's quite easy to do it in the established things like graphics, especially where you have a built-up graphics library, or things like outsourcing design. It's much more difficult to outsource physical labor tasks. So I would focus on graphics. Graphics is very saturated though. Programming, design, those are things. Sales support is actually something that I think people would pay for. How do sales engineers transfer project technology to the commissioning team? Help me better understand that question. Because the sales engineer to me would be transferring the design or the estimate to the ops team, who then would go and would execute alongside the commissioning team who has a commissioning plan. So I guess if I better understood your role, I could better answer that question. So if you want to type that, I'll come back to that. When in the process of growing, how have you managed wearing multiple hats, blending with your employees? Time management is tough. Having to be the sales estimator, service account, PM. Yes, it does. And the best advice I can give to you when you're doing that is to document and create processes. One of the reasons I feel like we are an efficient organization is because we have a lot of processes. Anytime you can create a process that someone less skilled than yourself can follow, you are going to be able to grow, because you don't want to hire the next Patrick. That would be too expensive. You want to hire someone who can focus on, and this is part of a guessing game, right? You have to kind of stick your finger in the air and be like, okay, I feel like sales is where it's at. That's where we're going to grow the most. Or I feel like PMing is where it's at. It's where we need the most. And once you identify that, you identify and develop your processes, and then you put the person in that role and they do that. And you gradually peel pieces off of you from an execution perspective. How do sales engineers, okay, I already did that. Yeah, if you want to clarify that, Shima, then I will go and answer that for you. Who prepares BAS control scenarios, control diagrams, system architecture, BAS plans in an organization? Typically, they are, I wouldn't call it commissioning team. At least here in the United States, we call it the executing operations team. But yeah, I get what you're saying. So I think that's part of where I was misunderstanding the question was, yeah. So commissioning team, for those listening, for Shima equals operations team. So that would be the designer. Typically, here in the United States, I can only speak for the United States. The designer on the operations team, or the commissioning team, as you call it, would execute. With growth in vertical markets across multiple controls, when do you add a programming manager to staff overall programmers? I mean, it depends. I've seen organizations that never have a programming manager. They just have an ops manager. And they use basically a matrix where all the programmers just kind of interact. I've seen organizations that have a manager for everything. They have a tech lead, they have a design lead, they have a programmer lead. It really just depends on, do you feel like your culture requires that? So I don't make that decision based on hours. I make that decision based on culture and productivity. Do I have a culture of programmers who are going to interact with one another and are going to be okay with clearly communicating where they're at to an ops manager or to a PM who's going to allocate them to projects? Or do they need someone to oversee them? So are these folks that you feed under the closet door, or are these folks who can actually interact with one another? That's how I would make that decision. If I start to notice that my programmers are getting overutilized, that my project managers are fighting over one another for my programmers, then it may make sense, excuse me, to split them off and have a manager who allocates them as kind of a pool of talent. I'm not going to give you hours because hours are deceptive. I would simply look at performance. Because 1,000 hours of programming VAV boxes is completely different than 1,000 hours of doing complex central utility plans. I apologize for coughing in y'all's ear today. Just this cold weather blew through and this whole room is just dry. I can literally feel my skin chafing and drying up as I talk to you. All righty. What other questions can I answer? Give you all a couple minutes to ask whatever else you got. Oh. I'm gonna lower my desk down. Okay. Not seeing any other questions. All right. That makes my life easy. I will give you all some time back in your day. Oh, wait. Here we go. There's one. I have 10 hours of BAS experience, technical BAS engineer, sales coordinator, and estimator. I want to know what can be my role. I mean, really, whatever you want it to be. Length of experience is less important than variety of experience. So I could have someone who did 10 years working on VAV boxes versus someone who did 3 years working at a complex tier 4 data center. And it's going to be a completely different level of experience. So I'd focus more on the type of experience rather than the time. I know folks like to look at time, and I know most job descriptions say time, but I recommend you just look at the variety. As far as will the recording be posted, it will be posted on our site under marketing or under our webinar replays. It'll probably also be put on YouTube. Usually put them there as well. You're welcome. As growth with 3 to 4 PMs managing projects, when do you add an installation manager? I'm going to give you the exact same answer I gave you about the project manager or the programmer manager, which is it depends on how folks are doing with labor. If the PMs are able to communicate and balance out, hey, we're going to share this much labor, we're not, then it makes sense. I'll tell you, I don't see that happen. PMs, I love project managers, but they tend to be greedy and they'll take what they can get as far as labor if they have the backlog to use it. So I will tell you, an installation manager usually comes sooner than a programmer manager. Usually it goes installation manager, designer manager, programmer manager, if it even gets to that point. Because there's just so much installation labor across so many projects. And it's very easy to have a programmer not travel to projects if you structure your team right. It's kind of hard to not have technicians not travel. And so you got to factor that in and manage that, because 8 hours of technician time is not necessarily 8 hours technician time if they have a 2-hour commute each way. Whereas with programmers, 8 hours of programming time is typically 8 hours of programming time unless they absolutely have to be on site. Does that make sense, Philip? I hope you don't feel like I'm being evasive. I'm just giving the answers the way I see them from my perspective. But I will tell you from a cultural perspective, it's usually much harder to get PMs to share managers, or PMs to share managers, PMs to share technicians than it is to get them to share designers or installers. Because that technician tends to be stretched across an entire project, whereas a designer or a programmer tends to exist for a point of time. Programmers a little less so, because if you have commissioning and complex commissioning, then they tend to have to get involved in that. But designers especially, they tend to be, hey, I'm at the beginning of the project and I'm at the very end to do the as-builts. And that's it. So great stuff. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. If you are interested in learning more about our training programs, I encourage you to go to smartbuildingsacademy.com and feel free to browse our training process and our training programs. Would love to work with you. I realize there's a lot of you on here that we do work with, so thank you so much for your business. And I appreciate your time today. I hope this was valuable to you, and I look forward to seeing you on a future podcast episode. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.